So I started reading Kimetsu no Yaiba or Demon Slayer, depending what you prefer, a short while ago, and I caught up to the manga. So today I'm gonna talk about my thoughts on the series because I made a poll on Twitter, on Discord, where I actually asked if you wanted to see my thoughts on Kimetsu no Yaiba now that I've caught up to the series, or if you wanted to see my current thoughts on The Promised Neverland. Now, The Promised Neverland didn't get quite as many votes. I'm still gonna make that video. I'm just not gonna make it yet. I might make it next week instead. But yeah, anyway, so Kimetsu no Yaiba, it's one of those shonen series that I think a lot of people don't know about, even though it is very popular in Japan, so it hasn't really gotten as much attention in the West as it has in the East. And it's a shame because Kimetsu no Yaiba, in my opinion, is a really interesting series. It's not quite my favorite weekly Shonen Jump series, but it's still very good. I think it's definitely within my top 5 within Weekly Shonen Jump. Now, I don't really read a lot of series, but I definitely read more than 5 mangas, and Kimetsu no Yaiba has its place within the top 5. And one of the main reasons, in my opinion, why it has is because, first of all, the characters are really interesting. They're not necessarily the most developed characters throughout the story. There is some development and some progression to some extent, but that's not really the main reason why I like these characters. I just like the chemistry between characters and how they interact with each other, and to a certain degree it's just because some of them are pretty interesting, they're pretty cool, based on what we know of them so far. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything super deep, when it comes to me and characters. Development isn't everything, progression isn't everything, although it is nice if we get that as well. Now, there is development in the series, and there's definitely progression in this series, even though it's kind of subtle to some degree, in my opinion, but you do get to see it to some extent. And I like that because I don't think development or progression should be forced. If you can really notice it right away, I think it's kind of done wrong, and Kimetsu no Yaiba doesn't really have that. You would really need to analyze it somewhat in order to really be able to tell that some of the characters may be growing on some ends. But not all characters grow as much as others. Obviously some characters are gonna have a lot more attention to them, and that's why they'll probably grow much quicker than some of the other characters that we have been introduced to. But that's okay. That's perfectly fine. Now, the fighting in Kimetsu no Yaiba is probably one of my favorites, simply because you don't typically have the main character straight up winning. In fact, a lot of the time, the main character struggles in his fights and he has help in order to win. Although, you could argue that sometimes the main character gets some sort of plot armor, but then again, that's not really unique to this series. Every series has some form of plot armor, even though in some series it's a lot more stronger, and sometimes, it's not as apparent. I think in this series it's done very well because, like I said, a lot of the time, some other characters, stronger characters, basically the main character superiors are actually the reason why they were able to win a certain fight, for example. Now, I'm not really gonna go into spoilers because maybe some people are watching this and you don't really want to find out too much about the series. You just want to see what I have to say about it, maybe. I don't know, so I'm not really gonna go too in depth. But one thing that you need to know going into the series is that it's quite brutal. You see a lot of brutal elements compared to some other shonen. Some may question that The Promised Neverland is quite brutal because, it's about children. It is officially a horror shonen, but you still get to see some blood and some pretty freaky shit in that series. However, in this series, it's very different, and I would actually question how Kimetsu no Yaiba is a shonen because it definitely doesn't feel like one. Yes, the interaction between characters definitely remind you of a shonen, so a lot of the elements definitely stick to the shonen mold, but then you have some of the other elements that you may argue is a lot closer to the seinen side of things. When was the last time you read a shonen? Let's say a weekly Shonen Jump series that is currently airing, and you see the characters' heads just pop off. Okay, because that's kind of what happens in this series sometimes. You can see some heads being decapitated. Not necessarily the good guys, but just the fact that you see people cutting off other people's heads may be, according to some people, not as shonen-like as you would imagine. And that's kind of what I experienced. I found that we see a lot of things being very brutal for a shonen, but at the same time, I don't really have a problem with that because I still read seinen as well, so it's not that I have a problem with the fact that they are are actually cutting heads off, I just questioned really how it's still a shonen. Regardless though, it's a really good series. It's a really good series. And it takes place in what seems to be the sort of samurai or ninja era. I don't really know exactly what to call it. And you have a demon theme being very strong in this series. Like, the demon theme is very much at the center of things in Kimetsu no Yaiba, and in my opinion that can be a really bad thing sometimes, because I really am fed up with how a lot of series are doing the whole demon shit over and over. Like, it's kind of becoming something that a lot of people just try to reuse because some other series managed to do it and it became popular, and it, you know, it just kind of worked. But then a lot of other series, they try to do it and they do it wrong, and so on and so forth. So when I originally went in to read this series, I was really afraid that this was gonna be the case, that it wasn't really gonna be as good as I had hoped. However, it kind of does work. But the reason why I think it works is because they do demons in a very different way from at least the other series that I've been reading. Like, when I read a series usually that is about demons, it's very much the stereotypical demons you have. You know, you have the whole demons that come from hell, you know, the descendants of Satan basically. But in this series, it reminds you a lot more of, I guess, vampires or something along those lines, because the demons have a weakness that reminds you of vampires a lot, and some of the elements that these demons are using also represent more of the vampire side of things. But at the same time, as far as visuals go, they're definitely demons, not vampires. And I don't really have a problem with that, because of the fact that these demons operate very differently from how you'd normally see a demon in a manga operate. Like, let's look at Seven Deadly Sins, for instance. In that series, demons work on a very different wavelength, I guess you could call it. Because there you have, you know, the human race, you have the demon race. The demons, they kind of live in a different world sort of thing, and they just kind of go over to the human world, whereas in this series, it's all part of the same world. You know, they all originate from the same place. It's just, well, we don't really know the origin of demons in Kimetsu no Yaiba, but we do know that they live in the same world. They don't like creep out from a different realm and just infiltrate the human world. In fact, all of the demons that we know of in Kimetsu no Yaiba, this is a slight spoiler by the way, but they all were human originally. Apart from maybe, you know, a original demon, but we don't really know much about that. So I'm not really gonna go too much into that, seeing as we don't really know. But now the last thing that I really want to talk about when it comes to my thoughts on this series is probably the art style, because the art style is something that a lot of people going into the series will notice is very different from what you'd expect. It reminds me a lot of traditional Japanese-esque art style, I guess you could say, in the way that it's drawn. You can really tell it's drawn on paper as opposed to being digitally created, because you can really like feel it when you read it that this was made by hand and it was scanned in. Like, a lot of people obviously do that when they create their mangas. You know, it gets scanned in from paper, but you get a much more feel to it when it comes to Kimetsu no Yaiba, and that's what I really like about it. Like, you can really see very clearly that this has a more traditional feel to it than maybe My Hero Academia, Dr. Stone, and so on and so forth. I think the closest thing you're gonna get to this art style is probably The Promised Neverland, and the reason is because both of them sort of feel a lot more rough and a lot more traditional in the way that they're drawn. Now, I don't really know if The Promised Neverland is drawn on paper or digitally. I honestly don't, but it feels like they both have this more traditional feel to it. But at the end of the day, I think Kimetsu no Yaiba's art style is the most traditional that I've seen, at least in the currently ongoing Weekly Shonen Jump series that I've been reading. Although, if you're gonna read this series, you better be prepared to get used to the art style, because some people will consider this art style at the beginning to be quite bad or quite unbearable. Mind you, I was one of those people, but I got used to it and now it's actually one of my favorites. It's not quite the favorite, but it's definitely way up there. I really like the way that Kimetsu no Yaiba is drawn and how it's visually presented in general. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say when it came to Kimetsu no Yaiba. I just wanted to give my thoughts on the series, you know, so far, because I recently started reading and I caught up. So obviously I'm quite new to the series at the end of the day, because I haven't really been following it for months or years, you know. I've just been catching up, really. That's all I've been doing. But I would love to know what you guys think about Kimetsu no Yaiba if you have read it. But if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest you at least give it a chance, because obviously it's not going to be for everyone. No manga is for everyone, but if it feels like this demon thing interests you, I mean, As far as demon series go, I think Kimetsu no Yaiba does it one of the best in my opinion. Maybe not the best, I haven't read every single manga obviously, but one of the better ones for sure. And as always, if you did, be sure to Detroit smash that like button if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. This has been Chaotic Plus, and remember everyone, Toga is waifu, Toga is Laifu.